Okay, so let's get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. I'm sure we're looking forward to this lecture and presentation today. It's a very interesting book. I hope some of you had a chance to read it. I'm going to skip all the preliminaries here so we can get to Mark. I just want to mention one thing. I will send an email to all of you tomorrow, early in the day, early in the morning, asking a simple question, but please give me an answer. The simple question is, will you come to the library next Wednesday if we have Mark here? And he'll still be doing it over Zoom for those of you who can't come to the library or aren't around here. But will you come to the library for an in-person presentation by him next Wednesday? And if so, we would also have a little wine and cheese afterwards for a short while for some conversation afterwards. But please just reply one way or another so that I can have an idea if there's enough interest to do it. And I'll be sending that out, as I said, tomorrow early in the day. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and we'll get the program started. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks everyone for coming. And let me underscore what Michael said. If you don't show up, no wine, no cheese. There you go. So I'm going to begin by being a little autobiographical to say that when this novel, this is my version of it in paperback, it was a long time ago. It cost $4. So when this came out, I was in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, having been an English major in college for only the last 3 terms of my college career. For the first part of it, I had been a math and physics double major because I loved doing math and physics problems. And in junior year, I found out I had to be thinking about a career, and I switched to English. As a result, when I got to graduate school, there were many things that other students read as English majors that I didn't know about. And most particularly, I was never in the habit of reading novels that were published contemporaneously with my life. I would read old stuff, Victorian novels, poetry, literary criticism, literary history. I don't think during high school or college, I ever read a novel that had come out in the last 2 or 3 years. It was not what I was interested in. And so one of my teachers at Wisconsin said, if you're going to become a professor of any kind of literature, you have to keep up with some of the stuff that's being published. And he said to me, for example, do you know the book Woman Warrior? Again, it had just come out in 1976. And I said, no. He said, well, you have to know it. You have to read it. And I was on very limited funds as a graduate student. And so I asked him the question I asked others of my teachers when they recommended a book. Do I have to buy it or can I just read a library copy? In other words, should I have it in my library? He said, buy it. And this is it. Many years old and falling apart and taped multiple times. So what's the deal here? The deal is that this series, this month, last month, and in June, seeks to correct not a misimpression of mine, but a possible misimpression if people are overfond of talking about the great American novel. Some of these books are small in the sense of intimate, not petty. Some of them aren't even novelistic in the traditional sense. They're collections of stories. This is 5 memoir, imaginative pieces. But when we get to The House on Mango Street, for example, by Sandra Cisneros, that's over 40 little vignettes. She calls them little stories, some of them only a page and a half. And for many people, it's hard to think of that as a novel, let alone a great novel. And part of what I hope to show in this 2-part series, 4 this spring, 4 in June, is how the American novel assimilated and reflected the various changes when you add women's voices, Jewish American, Mexican American or Chicana, Chinese American, Native American, African American, and so on. So I'm going to concentrate for a little while on the first story, No Name Woman, which is an odd beginning to a book called The Woman Warrior. The 5 sections of the book vary between models of very strong women, supernaturally, mythically strong women, and women who are so weak that they threaten to be erased or are erased or institutionalized in the sense of her uh, maternal aunt. So Woman Warrior begins, "You must not tell anyone," my mother said, "what I am about to tell you." That's how the remarkable opening chapter of Kingston's book begins. In revealing this secret, and indeed in going on to create an imagined biography for this woman who the family treats, quote, as if she had never been, Kingston places herself in a position similar to her aunt, the no-name woman. She's a violator of family honor. After all, she's telling us in print what her mother told her not to tell anyone. So the book begins with a violation enacted in language. The secret story of the no-name woman is communicated from mother to daughter as a cautionary tale for females. "Don't let your father know what I told you." This is a quote from the mother. "He denies her. It's the father's only sister. Now that you've started to menstruate, what happened to her could happen to you. Don't humiliate us. You wouldn't like to be forgotten as if you had never been born." So it's a rite of passage story, like Don't Go Out with Bad Men. And yet it's told as a secret that is being revealed by Maxine in the opening line of her novel. In this way, the story takes on another level of secrecy. It's not just a family secret, you must not tell anyone, but a secret among women. Don't let your father know that I've told you. And it takes on another level of narrative potency. Although the woman cannot be named and is forgotten by the family and the villagers, she is in fact memorialized for the very action that led her to be cast out of the family. She's remembered in being forgotten. That's a very powerful image. I have said to many of my students in colleges and to adults in book groups and forums and libraries that I could teach, I think, a very good course in how to read literature, focusing on just three themes: secrets, doubles, and ghosts. Ghosts, not only in the literal sense, but in the sense that something that's absent, that you're reminded of its absence by something that's present, like the discoloration on a wall after a rectangular painting has been taken down. So the great irony, the powerful irony is you must remember this woman that we've forgotten, even though we can't name her. So Maxine's mother effectively underscores the absence of the aunt from the family's memory by recalling her, by making her present, in converting her absence into a present. And I hope this doesn't sound like mumbo jumbo. The mother makes her a ghost, a being who can only be experienced as the presence of an absence. I just want to pause for a moment. The presence of an absence. If my Aunt May were still alive, she'd be present. If I think about the fact that she died many years ago, she's absent. But if I feel she's back with me in my mind, in my dream life, in my sleep, she shows up reminding me that she's gone. It's like grief. What is grief but the presence of an absence? That's what I mean by ghost. Something that's there and reminds you by being there that it's absent. Maxine later explains that in keeping the story secret for decades, remember, she was told this story when she was an adolescent, she has been complicit in the family's erasure of her aunt's memory. But there is more than silence. They want me to participate in her punishment, and I have, she says on 16 of my volume. That's near the end of this short first story. But she also imagines that her aunt is angry because Maxine, quote, is telling on her. Very childish expression, but it fits it. She thinks her aunt is angry, her ghost dead aunt, for this betrayal. Maxine is thus twice guilty in keeping the secret and then in publishing it. And this doubleness is joined by another image of doubling. I said that the three themes would be secrets, ghosts, and doubles, doubles in any number of ways. At the end of the chapter, she imagined that her drowned aunt on the other side of the reflecting surface of the water is waiting to pull down a substitute. She imagines as she looks in the water and sees herself that her aunt, who died in a well, is underneath the water waiting to exchange places with her. So, of course, that underscores what we already know, that this aunt, who was an embarrassment to her family by virtue of being a woman and showing her pregnancy in the way that her violator did not. Two people were guilty of this transgression, if you want to think of it that way, but one of them doesn't grow a belly. It's like the Scarlet Letter, where the hypocritical Reverend Dimsdale, the father of Pearl, doesn't show his pregnancy so he can walk among the parishioners, and it's Hester who pays the price and is imprisoned for adultery. This is how it opens. A model of Maxine is this no-name woman. We find that one of the things she's trying to negotiate is living in America, in Stockton, California, a little east of San Francisco, as someone who is not Chinese from China and not yet Americanized. And the subtitle of the novel, this collection of 5 stories, is called A Childhood Among the Ghosts, because on the one hand, there's the ghosts of her ancestors, not just no-name woman, but the many people who populate the story that her mother tells her in this traditional passage of information called talking story, which of course Maxine dislikes and loves at the same time, and is a great part not only of her moral education, it brings her closer to her mother and her family, and it also probably has something to do with her education as a writer. But one thing is those ghosts of her ancestors, the Chinese men and women, especially women, seem alien to her. And her mother refers to the pale-skinned Americans of California, most of whom are white in a mother's experience, as ghosts because they're so pale, they seem not to have skin, the less than white skin of your average Chinese American. Some people call it yellow. I won't use that term, but it has color beyond paleness. And so she's neither a pale American on the one side, nor a ghostly Chinese on the other. And she feels herself in limbo. And so one way to think of these stories, these vignettes, is what model of womanhood is available to such a woman that she can think about creating a life for herself. So the 5 stories, Maxine is only a protagonist in 2. The second one, called White Tigers, which is about Fa Mulan, the woman warrior, the Disney movie of some years ago, Mulan, putting the last 2 portions of that name together, is about that woman, a kind of Chinese Joan of Arc. She is the protagonist of that second story, and she's the protagonist of the last story, a song for a Bavarian reed pipe, when she's now in school and confronted by her own silence, and in a memorable and unnerving episode, the silence of another quiet Chinese girl. Around those 2 stories, the second and fifth, there's No Name Woman, which I just mentioned, discussed a little bit. There's Shaman, a long story about her mother as the protagonist, who is a medical doctor in China, Brave Orchid, and is another version of a woman of strength, like the woman warrior. Then at the Western Palace, the 4th story, which is also substantial, it's about a visit from her maternal aunt. Remember, No Name Woman is her paternal aunt, who's committed to an asylum because she just can't take being broken by being away from her husband so long, coming back and finding that he's rejected her and is married. Whether or not that's psychologically true, whether or not when Maxine says she seemed to be happy in the asylum, is not as important to my conversation tonight as the fact that, like the maternal aunt is not a figure of strength. Not to say it's either of them fault. No named woman has been abused by a man. A villager who, in Maxine's rendering, which is all imaginative, she only knows the basic facts of the story. Her mother wouldn't tell her anymore. So she imagines it was a man that she knew, that they had sex often, that maybe the young woman was flattered by the sex, even though she was raped, and would have liked to have kept the child, and so on. In the same way, at the Western Palace, in the way that the story about the maternal aunt is enacted, it seems to be that she's a victim of a heartless husband, or the system which separates families so the husband can go to the Golden Mountain, that is the New World of America, to make money, and can stay there for decades and start a new life. So those stories of broken women, I'll say as a shorthand, are interfused with the Mulan woman warrior, the shaman, and then at the end, a song for barbarian reed pipe, which is the second story that has Maxine as a protagonist. It merges together Maxine's silence and frustration at the silence of her classmate, and the story at the end about the poet who has learned to sing in captivity, who has been taken away from her people, and like Ruth in the Old Testament, not only survives, but flourishes in an alien land amid the alien corn. So we see very quickly in that overview that it's a kind of handbook for models of womanhood. The book won the National Book Circle Award for Best Nonfiction Book of 1976, and it was quickly followed in 1980 by another collection of stories, fictional and nonfictional, that is, nonfictional about people in her family that she knew, a book called China Men, a kind of companion book to this. So nonfictional in the sense of actually talking about experience of family members she knew, and then fictional in the sense that as a novelist, she's giving them biographies that she can't know they had because she's a novelist. To talk about this book, we're to understand that what she's doing is she's testing writing about herself and realizes that she's disadvantaged because she doesn't have a way to think about her own identity. How do you tell the story of yourself if you're caught between competing worlds? And to her credit, as a novelist, instead of just talking about the various ways that Asian or Asian American women would have been oppressed, abused, assaulted she's born in 1940s, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, she finds a way to transform her experience into the question, how do I write about my life if I'm not sure what my life is? And so it begins with telling her something that she can't repeat. It gives her information for power, and it disempowers her because she can't repeat it. When she imagines herself as Mulan, the woman warrior, her family wants her to revenge all the ills they have suffered. And in the myth, they write in ink and then carve with a knife into her back their grievances, the violations that have been done to the family. And you can be sure that many of those are by Americans to Chinese immigrants, although not only that. So that the body of Mulan that's now become Maxine becomes a text. And the revenge that she carries on her back is something that she has to remember. It is behind her because these are violations against her family and herself in the past, but they're not forgotten. And at the end of that section, when she fantasizes beheading a man who's a fat warlord and gutting another man and being handy with a sword. And she gives birth, as it goes in the myth about Mulan, to her baby, the product of a consensual union. But before she gives birth, she carries the bubble of the baby in her belly in front of her. And she says, I have the baby in front and the words of revenge, the violations and the need for revenge on my back. So what's on her back is the past that is not to be forgotten. And what's on her belly is the future that she hopes will be better because she will revenge those violations. And she says to us at the end of that chapter about the woman warrior, again, one of only 2 of the 5 that has her as a protagonist. That's the White Tigers. She says that she realized that the revenge was not the beheading, was not the gutting, it was not the swordplay, which is adventurous and cinematic and mythical and empowering. The revenge is the reporting. Just having the words on her back, just telling, is the revenge. And so language, writing, expression, even if it's not poetical, even if it's just a list of transgressions. At one point, she says she has a list in her head of 200 things she needs to tell her mother to explain the kind of person she is. Well, with 200 things to tell her mother, is it any wonder that she's become silent? She's overwhelmed by how much she feels she needs to express. But those images of being told a story you can't repeat, of being so frustrated with a girl in school who obviously is a kind of alter ego, that she terrorizes, brutalizes, assaults that girl to the point of tears to try to make her say anything. She says you can say or the, and the girl will not give in. We're told that in school, when she's about 12, she starts taking her paintings in school, and if they're on paper, she covers them over with black paint. If they're on a chalkboard, she covers them over with white chalk. And she says remarkably that she thought of it not as a blotting out, but as a theater curtain about to open. That is just brilliant. If you want to understand how to read a novel, any novel, pay attention to the similes, the metaphors, the images, the symbols. And if you're reading a novel that doesn't have a plot in the conventional sense, that doesn't seem to have the kind of things you can hang your hat on, like a consistent narrator, either first person or unreliable or omniscient or third person, to pay attention to, then look at the language. And for a young girl around the age of initiation, 12, 13, the age that you'd be confirmed or bat mitzvahed, to think of blotting out her pictures as a curtain in a theater about to open tells you that she's not erasing what she's drawn. She's holding it in abeyance. It will come out eventually. And in the course of the book, I think we're supposed to understand that it will come out when she learns, like that poet who is another woman warrior. She also becomes a woman warrior. Excuse me, I dropped my notes here for a second. Diane, the poetess who was born in 175 AD, who is taken into captivity, becomes a woman warrior, is held among the barbarians, and the barbarians are people who speak another language. The Chinese in Maxine's childhood, the story she hears, are always under threat by barbarians and bandits. Well, we all know what bandits are. Barbarians are people from a land who don't speak the language of the village they're attacking. The Romans referred to the Goths, the various Ostrogoths, Visigoths from the north, as barbarians because they didn't speak Latin. And if they didn't speak Latin, they couldn't have been very cultured. The word barbarian originates in the sound that a baby makes. Ba, 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 ba is where we get bottle. It's where we get babble. It's where we get baby. Barbarians are people who babble, who don't speak Latin, and their tongue makes them foreign, and their foreignness makes them primitive or savage. We think of barbarian as people who don't bathe, aren't educated, and tend to be violent. But the original meaning of the word was someone who speaks another language. And so this woman warrior, who was a poetess, we'd say poet now, learns to fight not by using a sword, but she learns the lesson centuries ago that Maxine learns in the novel. If you want vengeance, you have to talk. It has to be in words. And so while all the other people of the tribe that has captured her are playing flute music, she sings a song. She uses her voice and she sings a song that when she's liberated and married is translated so it can be played on Chinese instruments and it translates well. How do I get this to be encapsulated in this form or language? So, Song for a Barbarian Reed Pipe has the issue of language, a song with lyrics, of expression, it says something, and of art, it's music and words. And that's the glory of the book, that instead of just being an homage to a fantasy figure, part historical, I'm sure, and part mythic, of the woman warrior, which makes for a good epic. I haven't seen the movie, but I expect it makes for a good movie. She does something much richer and more complicated about writing. And that's what makes this novel great. So we're at the bottom of the hour. I wish I could say I timed it that way, but that's serendipity. I'll turn it over to Michael to help field any questions or comments. As always, I'm as interested in comments about what you thought of the book as I am in questions from you. So, Michael?
Okay, folks, well, as we've done, use the Q&A function to pass on any questions or comments, which I'll relay to Mark, and we'll give you a minute to do that. One of the things, Mark, in the meantime, that I thought was interesting, just in terms of writing style or writing structure, is the use of embedded narratives. So you have instead of someone's telling you a story, they have a character who's telling you a story that someone else told to them. And I think of it goes all the way back to the Greek and the Roman epics, where like that's how do you learn about what happened after the Trojan War? Well, in the Aeneid, Aeneas and others are telling the story of what happened to other characters. So I think in here you've got this embedded narrative kind of approach, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and let's be clear, in any culture, whatever the demographic or ethnographic background is, families and communities are bound by the stories they tell. And so when you were younger, if you met somebody, either as a classmate, a friend, maybe a possible person to date or even be romantically involved with, maybe someone to marry, and they had a distinctly different background from yours, how did you learn about them? You didn't say, what do your people believe in? What's your decalogue? Do you believe in God? No, you ask them to tell stories about growing up. And even if you're fascinated by the fact that their religion is radically different from yours, you're not asking them about doctrine. You're asking them about practice. You go to church on Sunday? Yeah, we go to church and it's a 3-hour-long ceremony because we're Baptist. Holy moly, we don't go to church at all, and so on. And so these stories within stories is a way that Maxine, like all of us, found a way to locate herself in her family's tradition. She has a very complicated relationship with her mother, who has trained her with talk story, who calls her little dog, but says at one point that the daughter, like the mother, is a dragon. She knows that her mother was a stronger, better, from Maxine's value system woman in China than she is here. And like a lot of young people, you have to grow older to appreciate just what you have in the mother you didn't appreciate when you were young.
Got it. So, uh, hmm. Okay, well, I don't see any questions emerging yet. The other thing that I thought's interesting in reading a little bit about the book uh, is that apparently she got a lot of criticism from people who almost were trying to make an argument like you've misrepresented things as if they're true,
Yeah,
like as if this is supposed to be considered a purely non-fictional book that's
yeah.
got
Let,
errors of history in it.
Yeah, let me say a word about that, Michael, because I'm aware of that, and I think it's right that we give a nod to that. I don't want to skew this conversation. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to think about. It began by a Chinese American playwright named Frank Chin. Other people agree with him. His criticism of the book is that what she calls Chinese culture, in criticizing it, the erasure of women by men, the dominance of women by Chinese men. Um, Girls are maggots in the rice. It's quoted in the novel. It's more profitable to raise geese than daughters. When you raise girls, you're raising children for strangers. The Chinese word for the pronoun I, when it's used by a woman, she says is slave. Frank Chin said, by accepting what are essentially biased American views of Chinese culture as fact, Maxine distorts for the average reader, many of whom are not Chinese or Chinese American, what Chinese culture is. Now, I have no patience for that argument, although it's important to recognize it. There are people more creative than I am, people who are more involved in literature, people who are Chinese or Chinese American as I'm not, who give credence to that. But Maxine's response has been, I'm not writing an ethnographic study. I'm writing a memoir. And remember, a memoir is not even a biography or a memory. A memoir is, this is how I remember it. And what she's saying is, this is how Chinese culture was presented to her. If you believe, as I feel we must believe, I certainly believe, that that story that she opens with is a story that her mother actually did tell her when she became capable of having children. If you believe that, then that story is a horrific introduction for a young Chinese American who's struggling anyways, a young Chinese American girl. And whether or not it's typical of Chinese culture or not is irrelevant to Maxine Hong Kingston and to me. But I'm glad you brought it up because it is a strain that is out there. It's not a majority view of the book. And I do think it's important to remember that we're reading fiction, and fiction that says, this is how I remember it. I also want to say, and I want to repeat this because we'll encounter this with other books in the remaining 5 books of this 2-part series. And that is, again, when you don't have a standard plot like The Great Gatsby, when you don't have a clear narrator like Nick Carraway or Holden Caulfield, when you don't have the conventions of what we think of the great American novel, that is, you want to win the girl or the guy less often, or the fortune, or independent living, think of East of Eden and so on, not East of Eden, This Side of Paradise. What do you look for? Look for the images and similes. So when she's taken off by her parents as a version of the woman warrior, to have their violations, their grievances carved into her back. We're told that what's being carved is a list of grievances. That is an indictment, just the list of the wrongdoing, nothing poetic, nothing florid. It's being painted on her back in ink and then carved in by a knife her father's holding. She says she could sense the iron smell of blood. And people who have smelled blood, especially hot blood, or tasted it, know that it has a metallic quality because there is, in fact, iron in blood. And she says in her description that she associates that smell with three things: a woman giving birth. Remember, she hasn't given birth at this point. The sacrifice of a large animal, something that her culture knows about, and her own menstruation. And so blood of childbirth, blood of animal sacrifice, and blood of her own menstruation. Well, the childbirth and the menstruation are clearly gender inflected for women. It's something her father doesn't experience. And the animal sacrifice is connected not just to her culture, but the idea that she's being maimed fictively. This is a myth, this is imagination. She's being maimed fictively because she's being sacrificed to the family's need for revenge. She would like to be important to her family in the Chinese way. She would like to cut off heads, like to gut the barons and bandits and barbarians who have attacked her people and culture. But she learned before the end of that story that the writing is the revenge. And she learned by the end of the whole book, in the Song for a Bavarian Reed Pipe, that the revenge, the warring is in the lyrics and the art, that you can tell, sing, write your revenge. And that's very rightly. And that's what the novel gives us, instead of your conventional reader, I married him, or I have the great American dream for power, or a house, or success, or what have you. It's a different kind of way to read when you're reading other voices in the American landscape, which is exactly what these two four-part series are about, whether it's the Midwest by Antonia, or the South in Wise Blood, or Chinese American, African American, Native American, Jewish American, all the voices that make an America that may not be as obvious in Hemingway, Faulkner, or Fitzgerald, or Wharton, all great writers, but nobody can be everything to all people. I'll take another pause, Michael.
Okay, well, I'm going to paraphrase this because I don't completely get it, so I'll paraphrase as best I can. So it's that Kingston carries on the tradition of honoring people by honoring their stories.
Is that the end of it? I just want to make sure I'm not interrupting.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, I do think, yes. So she's doing two things at once. She is repeating these stories because, as she says about her mother's talking stories are very powerful. Clearly, they've shaped this woman. Part of what Maxine's doing in this book is she's creating her own talking stories. That is a story that is being talked because the person telling it is intricate, is implicitly tied up in the story that's being told. That's what makes a tale and not a story. A tale has a teller. And in many literary tales, it's the person who's telling you the tale that you have to keep into consideration. Trust the tale and not the teller. What is this person telling me, despite what they think they might be telling me? So the talking story is something she honors, even as she gets tired of it, she says, in the way that most people at some stage in their lives, maybe many stage, get tired of their parents always telling them the right thing. But the thing that enriches it, that makes it a novel about a novelist, or writing about a writer, is that she wants to think she can accept that model of the woman warrior and she can be heroic to her family. And she realizes it's not a model for her. At one point, someone says about young girls, young women, well, you can pull sweet potatoes, or you can stay with us and learn how to fight barbarians and bandits. That's early on the alternative that is mentioned. You can either pull sweet potatoes, or you can learn how to fight barbarians and bandits. If that's your binary choice, you can either be a slave. Remember, it doesn't say you can stay here and create local governance. You can stay here and become an artist. You can stay here and become a mother and wife, even those traditional roles. No, you can stay here and work the fields. And however you feel about sweet potatoes and the pulling of sweet potatoes, we have to agree that it's menial work. You can do that, or you can learn how to fight barbarians and bandits. When she thinks of her choices as only that, and this is not to say that anyone's being that stark with her, but that's how she perceives it. I'm either a slave or I'm a warrior. She's going to choose the warrior in her imagination. But the work of the book in the 5 stories is to find some middle ground between being a slave and being a killer. And that is the poetess, Cheyenne, who is someone who, even though she's been separated from her people, can sing of her captivity, like the captivity of the people caught, by the river of Babylon, the Babylon captivity. We sang a song, how can we sing King Alpha's song in a strange land? How can we find the way to honor our God when we're not among our own people? You have to translate. And so the entire book is a heroic enterprise of translating the heroic, warrior-like myths of the Chinese culture she heard about, so much more attractive than being like her aunt who is committed, or the aunt who is pushed to suicide, until she realizes she can make other choices. And the image for that other choice comes from another Chinese legend. In fact, the first line of the story of the novel is a line from her mother. And the last page is about the poetess turned woman warrior turned singer of songs in a barbarian climate. It was also told by her mother. Her mother effectively gets the first and last words of the book. She doesn't have to accept what her mother says. She can translate it. And I have said before in some of my lectures, and I say it often in my teaching, translation is one of the great skills for all people. When you are trying to tell someone you care about how to do something, whether it's about cooking a recipe, or you're telling one of your children how to take care of their newborn, or you just want to figure out how to help one of your kids through algebra, you not only have to know what it is you have to tell them, you have to figure out, how do you tell this person? I was a tutor of physics for all of my years as a high school and college student. It was partly philanthropy, it was partly a job. And I recognized very early that there were students who could think conceptually, and I could explain how a parabola works by explaining the idea of a parabola. And there were other students who all you could say is, this is a formula, memorize it. I try to tell you why it's a formula and what it means. I don't think that's the way to teach you. And so let's do it by rote. Anyone who's ever taught, and I don't mean professionally taught, anyone who's ever tried to communicate your parents' knowledge to your children, know that it's always an act of translation. Even a recipe that's your grandma's recipe might have to be changed in order to stay the same, because they don't have that kind of tomato in Brooklyn that my grandmother got in Italy. So you change it in order to make it the same. In fact, the word in French, the only language I have besides English, for translation is traduire, Traduire, to translate. It's synonymous in its etymology with the word tradition. Well, tradition is passing something from generation to generation, and we lazily think of tradition as keeping something the same. No, it's keeping it alive. And the French etymology reveals the fact that sometimes to pass something on, you have to change it because that's what it means to move from place to place, generation to generation. Maybe you're explaining something that you learned as a young girl. I'm saying girl because this is a novel about women. You learned as a young girl from a woman, and now you're explaining it decades later to a man, a boy, who has a completely different culture and has no traction with the language in which you learn the recipe. You not only have to translate the language, you have to think, how do I tell this person what he or she needs to know, given what they know now? And that's an act of empathy. And that's the great glory of the book. She's going to try to find a way to sing a song so that we barbarians, we who don't know Chinese culture, Chinese language, not primitive savage people, just foreigners, how we can learn it as well. Good book.
That's very interesting commentary about the art of translation, and particularly picked up on what you were saying at the end there, that it's not just about translating from one language to another, but also the whole cultural context of what that language is in. The other thing that's really interesting about this book in that respect is that you've got a language system which is so radically different to begin with in the way things are expressed. It's one thing to translate something from Spanish to Italian, where their languages are almost the same, but to go from pictograms into, phonetic language is a whole nother enterprise.
Michael, I'm going to ask, I'm going to make another comment, and then I'm going to ask if there's more input. I'm going to repeat and extend the point I've already made because it's important to this series beyond this book, this idea of translation. So there's a terrific nonfiction book called The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down by a nonfiction journalist writer who teaches at Yale or did, named Ann Fadiman. The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And it's reportage on a Hmong, Hmong, native person of Laos, child who suffered from multiple seizures because he was epileptic. And his family was living in California, but they absolutely believed, as many ancient cultures believed, that epilepsy was a visitation from the gods, that Julius Caesar had epilepsy, and it helped that Romans believed that it was the mark of providence that great men, maybe women too, I don't know, are epileptic. And so the issue that the doctors confront in these health clinics, because they're indigent people, this young boy's, and he's just an infant, like a toddler, and they treat him for years. It's all outpatient medicine in emergency rooms. Is they're not faithful about giving him the medicine because they think that what he has is an example of the spirit catching up with him, and he falls down because he's filled with spirit. Like certain Pentecostals believe that when God visits you, when you're filled with the Holy Spirit, your limbs go frenetic and so on. I'm not saying any of this in a critical way. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible. And so the problem that the doctors had is they were trying to cure a patient whose family not only didn't think he was ill, they thought it was a gift. And they had to try to find a way to translate for them what it is that he needed. Closer to my own experience, I have done a lot of work with Catholic theology from a philosophical and historical point of view. One of the people in my dissertation was John Henry Cardinal Newman, who is considered a traitor to England because he converted from being an Anglican in the 19th century to being Roman Catholic, which was seen as a kind of treasonous act. They gave him grief because they knew that the Catholic Church, in teaching people to convert, had a doctrine that it called the doctrine of economy. I'm getting back to translation. I'm not trying to convert all of you. The doctrine of economy is that God's revelation takes place slowly over time. And so people who believe in it can say, it's time for women to be priests because in the time of Paul and Peter, you couldn't sell the idea of women being priests. But now in the 21st century, or maybe back in the 17th or 16th, God help us, maybe we could have floated the idea that women, from a Christian point of view, from a humane point of view, can also be priests. And so the idea was that the revelation of God's gifts are economized, they're held back. And the way this was done in the conversion of non-believers is, if you were trying to convert native peoples in South America or in America, and you knew that they believed in polytheism, you knew that they believed in many gods, because many of the Indians of the plains who were hunters and gatherers said, if you got a God who controls the rain, I'll pray to him. I need such a God. You got a good God with the wind? I'll take him. They were not combative about taking on new gods. If you're trying to teach someone Christianity who is a polytheist, maybe don't make the Holy Trinity less than one. Maybe hold back and not burden someone who you're trying to teach that there's only one God, although in three parts, still a conundrum. It's all right. It's not a lie. It's not a deception to say they're not going to be ready for this complicated idea, given who they are. It's not that they're stupid. It's that they already believe in multiple gods. If we want to focus their attention on a single God, maybe save the Holy Trinity for less than 99. We will see in some of the things that we do that this notion of having to think about not just what needs to be said, but the condition, the cultural condition of the person to whom it's being said is critical.
Okay. So right now there are no open questions. I'm sure that people are thinking through that. It's a very interesting path that we've gone on now.
Well, even if they're not, it's okay. Even if they're not, it's okay. I have nothing against silence.
Sure. But I'm wondering, as we go forward with the rest of the books, um, how the concept of translation from one cultural context to, I mean, let's just say the cultural context of the writer into the cultural context of the U.S. at that time, uh, broadly speaking, like, is that something that you see is going to be woven into all the next books?
Yeah. So let's take Song of Solomon, for example. There are people in the novel who believe in not magical realism, magic. In Beloved, which was not the novel we're doing Song of Solomon, but I'll give the example of Beloved. I think people are more aware of that than of Song of Solomon. You absolutely have to believe when you read that book that the woman who has come back with a scar around her neck is in fact the now living and aging daughter that the woman who is her mother cut her throat to save her from a life of slavery. It's not a metaphor. It's not it's absolutely saying this is that woman. And if you say, how can I possibly believe that that's happening? Well, the whole book is made up. And Samuel Johnson, a great English 18th century critic, said, if you can believe a little, you can believe more. If you can believe when you go to see Julius Caesar in Samuel Johnson's London, that the guy playing Brutus is not your butcher, because you know the guy, but in fact is Brutus, you can believe that the whole play takes place in 2 hours when actually it's 9 years. He had no patience for the kind of stagnant realism. So you have to accept that you have to give yourself over, if only for the understanding of the book, to other people's belief systems. You may know that a couple of decades ago, 2 social scientists did a study, some people contested it, in which they found that readers of literary fiction, that is fiction that had characters that seemed like people, not genre fiction, not Western spy stories, romances, detective stories in which characters aren't really rich, it's more plot driven. This seems the same thing over and over again. but the kind of novels that I do with you, I do in libraries, most high school, college courses, my book groups privately do, where you talk about the motivations of characters as if they really existed. The thing about translation is this: if I want to talk to you as a student in my class, not someone invisible to me tonight listening to this lecture, which I'm grateful for, and I hope you getting something out of it. But if I'm actually teaching you in an exchange in a classroom, the question is not just what do I know and want to tell you, but who are you who is going to understand this? The first issue only concerns what I know and is very self-involved. What do I want to say next time about Song of Solomon? But if I'm forced to think, as I am, if I think of myself not just as a teacher, but a translator, as I do, as I have for all my teaching life, is what do you need to hear to understand this? The first question is selfish. The second question involves empathy. In the same way, if you're a parent teaching a son or daughter how to be a parent, you know that it's not just what you know, it's what Eleanor or Bob is prepared to accept. That's what makes teaching, that's what makes reading books, that's what makes translation an act of connecting and not just passing knowledge over a bridge. And that sounds like a curtain line to me, Michael.
Well, I'll just throw out one comment right on your translation point. It's a little bit of a contrast to how you ran up to the end. The person is asking, can translation also be traitorous in that translation can never be completely accurate?
Well, so my short answer is no, only because that question loads the case. If we agree, as I think everyone must agree, that translation can never be completely accurate, slightly inaccurate is miles away from traitorous. That's really loading the case. And if the person meant the question as they asked it, then the answer is no. Can translation misrepresent intentionally or unintentionally? Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a young woman who was scheduled to see me in the office I'm sitting in some years ago, for whom English was her second language. We had an appointment at 1:00 in the afternoon, and I asked her to send me days before the appointment the document that she wanted me to counsel her about. And instead, she sent it to me at 10:00 in the morning for an appointment that was 1:00 in the afternoon. And I sent her a note, not scolding her, but only trying to suggest that sending me something that I wanted 2 days before, just hours before, was not helpful, and I'm not sure I would be prepared. And I said to her, next time, maybe don't send it in the 11th hour. Forgetting that English was not her language. She wrote back a note, so anxious because she read my note to her as saying, where were you in the 11th hour when we had our appointment and you didn't show up? And she wrote, Dean Schenker, I thought we were meeting at 1, not 11. And I figured out what she meant. I waited for her to show up, and I apologized for using an expression that she couldn't possibly understand. And when I asked her, how do you say in your language, which I don't remember, the 11th hour, when I explained what it meant, when the last minute, it was something very different. It was something like, don't wait until the meal's on the table to eat. I mean, it had nothing to do with clock time. And there you have a perfect example where I was being sloppy in talking idiomatically to someone who I knew was not a native speaker, but I wasn't putting it together. So yes, translation can misrepresent intentionally or otherwise. I have a friend who translates Shakespeare's plays into American Sign Language. He knows someone who translates them into the languages of the Indian subcontinent. That person who does the Indian continent, he translates a line in Henry IV, which says, this news has warmed my heart when a countess finds out that her son has survived a battle wound. He translates that as, this news has cooled my heart, because nobody in India wants their heart warmed. if you live in a hot climate, good news is cooling, not warming. So an exactly 180-degree translation is necessary in order to keep the meaning the same. I can't think of a better example of how it's not just what you want to say, it's who you want to say it to. And translation is always dicey. That's why I'm giving it so much attention. That's why people write books about it. That's why you couldn't do this book in just 10 pages of, let me explain what it was like to grow up the way I did. Okay, thank you all again. I'm happy for your presence. It looks like there was some 50 of you at one time. Thank you, Michael, again, not only for the invitation, but for hosting. And next week, we're back for the fourth of these, either in Wilton or on Zoom. It's up to you all. Vote early and often, and I'll see you one way or the other. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everybody for coming. And we'll see everybody next week, either really see you in person, depending on the votes, or we'll see you on Zoom. Thanks again. See you again. Good night, Mark.
Good night. Thank you, Michael.